بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, may Allah Ta'ala reward all of you and bless you for gathering again with us today virtually in part 2 of our workshop in preparation for the blessed month of Ramadan. As I had mentioned last night, our teachers tell us that when the heart is eagerly anticipating Ramadan, when the heart is excited to receive the month of Ramadan, this is a very beautiful sign that the heart is alive and that the heart is filled with love for Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So in coming together to review the rulings of fasting and to learn about the spiritual dimensions of fasting, we are preparing ourselves to receive the blessed month as an honored guest. That is a very beautiful sign of Iman in the hearts. Yesterday, we were talking about the fiqh of fasting, the laws and the rulings pertaining to the fast in the month of Ramadan. And today, inshallah, we're going to look at the spiritual dimensions. Before we begin, I want to talk about that dichotomy between the outward and the inward and how we merge the two of them together. So last night we talked about the fiqh of fasting. And fiqh, as we said, it measures the outward. It looks at the objective and observable standards. So in the faqih, the jurist, the scholar of law, will look at what the person is doing outwardly to make a determination if that person's fast or if their prayer is valid by the external objective standards of the law. And that's the domain of the faqih, the jurist. That doesn't say anything, however, about the inner dimensions of the person's prayer or their fasting. The faqih, the scholar, jurist, doesn't have access to the inward of the person. So the inward is not from the domain of the faqih. Fiqh will tell us about the conditions and the pillars, the things that are necessary and what will render something valid or invalid in ritual worship. Fiqh will not be able to tell us anything about what's going on inwardly in our prayer, or in this case, in our fasting. So fiqh is concerning the outward domain on the realm of Islam, as in ritual worship. The domain of the heart, or the domain of the spirit, is the domain of ihsan. Nevertheless, when we're talking about the spiritual dimensions of fasting, we have to understand that there is some overlap here. In other words, it's not a complete dichotomy where the two are absolutely separate from one another. The outward aspects of fasting and the inward aspects of fasting aren't two separate things without any connection. There's overlap because the physical has an effect on the spiritual, and the spiritual will have an impact on the physical. For example, if a person cultivates stillness, that will help them have presence in their prayer. If they cultivate stillness inwardly through remembrance of Allah and disciplining the self, it will have an effect on their physical body where they will fidget less. So when the person has more hudur, more presence and humility in prayer, that will translate in them fidgeting and moving around much less during the prayer. Likewise, if the person cultivates physical stillness and disciplining themselves to be still physically in the prayer, that actually helps them focus and have presence of heart during the prayer. So there's this overlap there, intertwined and have a relationship with one another. And the same thing goes for fasting. If fasting is done properly, it will make one more aware and sensitive to their environment. It will make one more sensitive to what's coming into them through the other senses. They'll be able to, through the act of fasting, control their gaze. They'll be able to control their tongue. And the same is if the person has active control of the eyes and ears, that will enhance the fasting. So fasting as a physical action makes us more sensitive and helps us to control the other senses. Likewise, if we control the senses purposely, that will enhance the fasting. That is, those overlap between these two. So every outward practice and ritual is spiritual, but we have to look at the inward dimensions, the things that the ritual worship should be developing in us, and the things that we should be working on while we're fasting in the month of Ramadan. So the month of Ramadan is that month where Allah Ta'ala gives us the opportunity to hit the restore factory settings of our soul. It's that chance to reorient ourselves for the coming year. It's the chance to turn inward and focus on what's really important. And it's not left up to us. If it was up to us, then maybe we wouldn't do it. But because Allah Ta'ala has made it an obligation, He has given us, out of His mercy, that chance to enhance our spirituality, to purify our soul through the discipline of fasting. So this is what we really need, and Allah has made it obligatory so that we do go inward and focus on these things. Now, there's a basic principle that we have to understand to really get a sense of what we're after in the month of Ramadan. And that principle is that the more you increase in the physical, you decrease correspondingly in the spiritual. So in our tradition, we have the concept of al-hiss wal-ma'na. Al-hiss is the sensory, it's the physical senses, the eyes, the ears, the senses, what we take in through our senses. This is the hiss, the sensory perception. And we have an inward perception, which we call ma'na, or that spiritual faculty. And there's a relationship between these two, where if you strengthen one, you tend to diminish the other. So if you strengthen one, you'll diminish the other. For instance, if a person limits what they're looking at, limits what they're listening to, and they increase in spiritual practices, this will develop the ruh, and the ruh will become more sensitive. The ruh, as the essence of the human being, will become more sensitive. And in that sensitivity, they will pick up on things going on around them. Certain things that didn't bother them before will bother them. Certain things they didn't notice or pay attention to, they'll now notice. And their awareness will be increased such that their dreams tend to be more vivid. They tend to have a better understanding of people and what's going on. And that's because the spirit has been sensitized through reducing the hiss, the physical appetites. And the opposite is also true. If we increase in the physical, we tend to diminish the spiritual. So if we're overeating, if we are binge watching Netflix, if we're listening to all sorts of inappropriate things, if we're talking too much, eating too much, sleeping too much, looking at too much, all of these things will weaken the ruh, will weaken the spiritual. And that will lead to a lack of sensitivity in the spiritual faculty of the human being. It's kind of like a person who is handicapped. If a person is blinded, they tend to hear very well. If a person is in a wheelchair or a lower body injury, you'll find that because their lower body isn't functioning properly and they're using the wheelchair, they have a very strong upper body. If a person is blindfolded, and they become very sensitive in their hearing. They notice things that we don't always notice. So anytime you're diminishing one thing, you're going to enhance the other. Ramadan is the month of fasting. In the month of fasting, we are staying away from food and drink and intercourse as the minimum that we have to withhold from. But then there's other things that we should withhold from and diminish so that the spirit is strengthened in this time. We're putting the damper on all the noise that's surrounding us and using the month as the opportunity to go inward and to reflect and consider our ultimate purpose and reason for existence, to worship and know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he told us, من صام رمضان إيمانا واحتسابا غفر له ما تقدم من ذنبه. Whosoever fasts the month of Ramadan out of faith and with anticipation of reward, their past sins will be forgiven. This is the glad tidings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that fasting will be a means of our sins being forgiven, provided the state we have coming into Ramadan is iman and ihtisab. These two concepts are very important. So it means that when the person is fasting Ramadan by just withholding from food and drink, that's no guarantee. It has to also accompany these two qualities, imanan wa ihtisaba. Their hal, their condition, their state has to be, when they're fasting in Ramadan, that they're doing it out of iman, out of conviction that this is the command of Allah Ta'ala, and I'm doing this because my Lord commands me to do it. And that's the first quality. The second quality they have to bring into the month of Ramadan is ihtisab, that they anticipate reward from Allah Ta'ala. And this anticipation is based on the foundation of having a good opinion of our Creator, a good opinion of Allah, حسن الظن بالله, أنا عند ظن عبدي بي. As the Prophet ﷺ relates to us in the Hadith Qudsi, Allah says, I am as my servant thinks of me. So we're encouraged by the Prophet ﷺ in this Hadith to make sure that we're fasting out of conviction that it's the command of Allah, and with a good opinion of Allah, anticipating the very best. So this is the state that we have to bring as we're entering the month. The idea of Ramadan is imsak. It is that withholding and refraining. And there are degrees of that we're going to go into, inshallah. But before we do that, I want to just look at what that entails or how we frame the issue. You know, in contemporary politics, you hear politicians sometimes saying that if they get elected, they want to go to Washington, D.C. and drain the swamp. You've probably heard that before on the news or on talk radio. The politician is promising his constituents that if he's elected, he will go to Washington, D.C. and he's going to drain the swamp. So the idea is there's a swamp. It's full of toxic waste and pollutants, and he wants to go and drain it so that it becomes clear, pure, and clean, and get rid of the toxic waste. So Ramadan is for us that chance to drain the swamp too. And we're the ones who have to do the draining. The draining of the swamp. The swamp in this analogy is our own heart, our own nafs, our own self. It is the opportunity by Allah obligating it on us to drain the swamp, to clean ourselves so that our hearts, our nufus, become clean, life-giving bodies of water or clear ponds. One of the great imams of our tradition, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayh, he talks about this idea of cleaning the swamp or draining the swamp. And he wasn't talking about Ramadan particularly, but the analogy really stands for Ramadan too. He was talking about the idea of khalwa, of spending time alone, kind of how many of us are in the stay-at-home order. But he talks about staying home or avoiding fitna. And he talks about the benefits. And he says that one of the benefits of this, and I believe it applies to Ramadan too, if done properly, he says one of the benefits is that it removes the things that cloud the heart that come in through way of hearing and sight. He says that the hearing and the sight are the dihliz leading to the heart. Now, dihliz is a Persian word. It might exist in Urdu, I don't know. But the dihliz is a Persian word that was used heavily in the Abbasid period, and it's in the Arabic dictionaries. The dihliz is that in-between space. It refers to the haush, they call it in Yemen, that inner courtyard of the house. So you have the outside of the house, the perimeter, you have the inside of the house, and then you have that in-between space, the courtyard, usually surrounded by a wall. This is the dihliz. He says that the hearing and the sight of the human being are the dihliz leading to the heart. And he says that the heart is like a pond, a body of water that collects all of this dirty and brackish water from the rivers of the five senses. So he paints a picture for us of a pond, a body of water that is dirty. It's a swamp, essentially. And there's streams going into it, feeding into it. And these streams are coming from the five senses. So you can imagine there's a pond, and the hearing creates a stream that goes into that pond. The sight creates a stream that goes into that pond. Touch, the stomach, the sense of smell, the senses, the sensory, his, each of them represent a stream that leads to the heart. So he says that the idea is to drain the water of the pond, to drain the pond of the water rather, and to get rid of the toxic waste and all of the things that are being added to that pond, and to refill it with clean and pure water. He says, how are you going to do that? How are you going to make the pond clear if the streams from the senses continue to dump toxic waste into the pond? You can get 1,000 shovels and employ many people to dig out the toxic waste in that pond. But as soon as you dig out the toxic waste, more is going to come in from those streams. So the solution is not just to dig out the toxic waste inside the pond, but to also cut off the sources of the toxic waste. And those sources, according to Imam al-Ghazali, are coming from the senses, from the eyes, from the ears, and these are the sources. So in Ramadan, we're trying to develop taqwa. We're trying to develop that God-fearingness, that consciousness of Allah Ta'ala through limiting the intake of food and drink, through disciplining our souls. And with that taqwa, there comes that strength to be proactive in limiting the toxic waste that comes in to our heart through the senses. And this is really how we should frame the fasting, and not just see it as staying away from food and drink until iftar time, after which we stuff ourselves and go right back to the same activities through our senses that pollute our hearts. So, having said that, Imam al-Ghazali, in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he gives a very brilliant discussion about the levels of fasting. And he says that when it comes to fasting, there are 3 types of people, or there are 3 grades of fasting. And the first grade of fasting, we actually talked about last night. The second grade or level of fasting, we're going to talk about today. The third level of fasting is perhaps for another time. He says in his Ihya Ulumuddin, in the chapter on the inner dimensions of fasting, he says that you should know that there's 3 grades of fasting. There is the grade for the amma, or the general body of people. Then there is the grade of fasting for the khassa, for the elect or the elite level of fasting is a more enhanced. And then you have the level of fasting for the khasatul khasa. So we're looking at fasting on three levels. He says that the first level, the level of the amma, is merely abstaining from food and drink and sexual relations. In other words, the fasting on the lowest degree is doing the absolute minimum required so that the fast is seen as valid in the eyes of the Sharia. So it's only looking at the externals. Did that person abstain from food and drink and relations? Yes. Therefore, he fasted. That is the level that we discuss in the books of law. But as we said earlier, there's an inner dimension that has to be looked at too. The second dimension, or the second grade of fasting, he says, is that one is also fasting with their ears, with their eyes, with their tongue, with their hands, and with their feet. How do you fast with those organs? How do you fast with your eyes and your ears and your hands and your feet and these other things? You are fasting with those through also doing imsak, refraining from allowing toxic waste to come into your heart through those avenues. And we're going to look at those individually. The third one, which is the fasting of the khasatul khasa, the elect of the elect, the elite of the elite, the tier one level of fasting, if you will. He says that is the fasting of the heart itself from everything that distracts one from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This level, he says, is reserved for the elite of the elite. And the iftar from that fast would be being preoccupied with other things besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Obviously that is the level of ihsan. And that level of ihsan is not attained until one has fasted on the tier 2 and the tier 3 levels, which is the outward and the inward. So what he's telling us is, if you want to get the most out of Ramadan spiritually, you have to go beyond the bare minimum described in the books of law of just abstaining from food and drink and sexual relations from the time of the true dawn until Maghrib time. And you have to also fast with your other organs. You have to fast with your eyes by not looking at things that are displeasing to Allah Ta'ala or disliked, things that distract the heart. Obviously, the bare minimum of that would be avoiding looking at what is haram for men and women. As the Prophet ﷺ said, that an-nadra sahmun masmun min sihami iblis. The furtive gaze is one of the poisoned arrows of shaitan. And this is a big challenge for us in this society and indeed the world in this day and age. And the Prophet ﷺ said in one hadith that if the person controls their gaze for the sake of Allah, they will receive a sweetness of faith in their heart. They will receive a sweetness that they didn't have before. Fasting with the eyes is avoiding looking at things that are haram. And this means for us, if we go to the bare bones, it means giving Netflix a miss in Ramadan. It means guarding the gaze, right? Because if we're in a shutdown as we go through Ramadan, then maybe we're not going out that much. So where would this be violated? It will be violated on these things, on devices, excess watching of things. That's where most people are exposing their eyes to things that are displeasing to Allah Ta'ala. One wants to fast with the eyes as well as fasting from food and drink and so on. Likewise, one's fasting with their tongue. So they're fasting with the tongue by avoiding idle chatter, by avoiding backbiting, by avoiding gossip and lying, avoiding obscenity and curse words, avoiding arguing, and keeping to silence as much as possible. They're fasting from excess, useless speech. Fasting it's very important that one controls the tongue when fasting, because there is an opinion among some of the ulama historically that backbiting breaks the fast. This is actually an opinion that exists among some of the fuqaha. It's not the majority position, but it does exist. It's related from Sufyan al-Thawri, rahmatullahi alayhi, who had his own madhab in law, his own school of law that is now extinct. But it is recorded that that was his position, that backbiting actually breaks the fast. And it was also the position of Layth ibn Sa'ad, one of the contemporaries of Imam al-Shafi'i. And it's also a recorded position from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal that backbiting people actually breaks the fast. And that person would have to make up the day. That's not the position of the other schools. In fact, when you look in the other schools of law, when they talk about the muftirat, the things that break the fast, and the things that don't break the fast, many of them are very careful to mention that backbiting doesn't break the fast. And the reason why they mention that is because it was and is a position of a very small minority of scholars historically that it does. But the fact that that position was held shows you how serious it is, that backbiting people will ruin and spoil the fast, if not on the level of Sharia outwardly, where they have to make up the fast on another day, it will ruin it inwardly. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ says, whoever doesn't leave off lying speech and false testimony and acting on it, Allah Ta'ala is not in need of him leaving his food and drink and going hungry and thirsty. We have a very profound hadith on this subject from the Prophet ﷺ. It's mentioned that in his time there were two women who were fasting in Ramadan, and during the day they became very, very tired. They were almost on the verge of collapsing because of their fatigue. And they sent a message to the Prophet ﷺ asking for permission to break their fast. And the Messenger of Allah ﷺ sent them a bowl and said to them, to the messenger, he sent this person with a bowl and said, tell them to vomit into this bowl whatever they have been eating, whatever they ate earlier. And the bowl was brought to one of the women and she vomited. And half of the bowl filled up with blood and pieces of flesh, fresh, tender, raw flesh. And another bowl was brought and the same was filled for the other woman. And the Prophet ﷺ said in this narration that these two women have been fasting from what Allah has made lawful for them, food and drink. But they broke their fast on what Allah has made haram for them. They sat together and indulged in gossip and backbiting. And here, he said, is the flesh of the people they were backbiting. SubhanAllah, we see this is a miracle of the Prophet ﷺ because the people they backbit, well, they were completely healthy. Their backs were not eaten literally. However, the spiritual effect of the sin of backbiting manifested on the physical plane in this miracle where others could see the tangible physical effect of the spiritual sin of backbiting while fasting. So one has to be very careful. And again, just like with the gaze, if we're in a shutdown, the chances of people backbiting are most often going to be found on these things, on devices, on social media, and not in public spaces because of the social distancing. So really, the key, I feel, for getting the most out of Ramadan spiritually is to really curtail this, the use of devices. And the same applies to controlling the passageway of the ears, that we're fasting with our ears by closing the ears and avoiding listening to things that are displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's eavesdropping, whether it's listening to backbiting, whether it's listening to things that are displeasing to Him that are unlawful. That is fasting with the ears. And fasting with the hands means not touching things that are haram, and fasting with the feet are not walking to things that are haram. And fasting with the stomach on the spiritual level means that you're avoiding eating at iftar time things that are of doubtful nature. This is a kind of fasting of the stomach beyond the fasting of abstaining from food and drink. but it's abstaining from doubtful matters. And that would include also avoiding overeating. Imam al-Ghazali, he talks a lot about this in the Ihya Ulumuddin. In the section on fasting, he talks about overeating, and he mentions lamenting the fact that it's a custom for so many that they're actually eating more fancier foods in Ramadan than outside of Ramadan. And one of the objectives of fasting, he says, is to experience hunger. It is to reinforce the ruh, to strengthen the ruh through the diminishment of food. And that's defeated when we stuff ourselves in the iftar time or in the suhoor time. And the idea is that as we're fasting during the day, we're not eating anything from before Fajr time until Maghrib. And when we're breaking the fast at iftar time, the objective is not to eat the equivalent of a lunch and a dinner and 2 snacks, whatever we had missed during the day. It's just to eat a simple meal that will fill us, to give us the energy to spend time in worship. We're not trying to make up for lost time by eating 2-3 meals and stuffing ourselves in the iftar time. So one should also be mindful of that, because the objective of fasting is to enhance the ruh by diminishing the intake through our physical senses. And that includes the content or the quantity of what we eat. We should be eating less at iftar time and less in suhoor. The net amount should be less than what we're normally eating on other days of the year. And finally, we want to remember that ihtisab, that anticipation of reward as we're fasting. This means that when we're breaking the fast, we're anticipating reward and we have hope in Allah's acceptance and forgiveness, while also we fear that the fast might not be accepted. We shouldn't presume just because we observe the outward of the law that it's going to be accepted. We have to always ask Allah to accept from us the fast, even if we observed all of the outward rulings of the fast. We ask Allah to accept from us and not take us to task for the inward failings we have while we're fasting. So this is the gist of what Imam al-Ghazali gives us as advice. In terms of how we want to go into the month of Ramadan, there's some helpful ideas and some advice I'd like to give myself first and foremost, and then all of you, inshallah ta'ala. And these are things that we should prepare for before Ramadan starts. So we still have some days. Number one, we make the intention to do it for the sake of Allah ta'ala and to please Allah ta'ala. That's always first and foremost. And we want to have the attitude of anticipation. Second of all, my advice to myself and then to all of you is to forgive the people who have hurt you. There's all sorts of situations we have going on in our lives where people may hurt us intentionally or unintentionally. And if we can forgive those people who have hurt us, we are freeing up the mental space and spiritual space to receive Ramadan without those things on our mind. I'm sure many of you have had Ramadans in the past where you were going through things and maybe you had some conflicts with people. Maybe it was family issues, maybe it's a thing with friends and associates. Obviously, to free yourself of those burdens before the month begins, it's a very beautiful thing. It frees up that space. The second advice is to make more dua. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit of detail soon. To just use the month of Ramadan as an opportunity to make more dua than you usually do. And third, to find a bad habit that you have, whether it's a soft addiction or a hard addiction, and look for some bad habit that you can include in the fast. So for instance, bad habits, I mean, people may say eating chocolate is a bad habit. If you find that it's affecting your health and you're eating way too much of it, then that could be considered a bad habit for you, even though it's not sinful. If there's other bad habits that you struggle with, consider in your own life what those bad habits are that you want to work on. You don't have to take all of them at once, but consider one or two bad habits that you want to get control of and eradicate, and incorporate that into your fast. So for instance, let's use the chocolate analogy. I don't have the bad habit of eating too much chocolate. Uh, maybe other things, maybe ice cream sometimes. But if you have a bad habit of eating too much of something and you do feel it's affecting your health, make a commitment to include that in your fast so that you're fasting from that, so that by the end of the 30 days, you have broken that habit. Some people, it's not food. For some people, it's the way they talk to people. Maybe they use curse words. Or already they should be fasting with their tongue by not using obscenity. But maybe they should consider fasting from foul language with a particular focus. Perhaps they make a jar, and if they say a curse word, put $1 in it and give that money in charity, in addition to whatever extra charity they can find that they want to give in this blessed month of Ramadan. So these are some ideas. Most important thing is to remind ourselves that the fast is about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is about Allah ta'ala. Allah ta'ala is the one we seek to please in this month, and the one we seek to please in breaking those habits. And He is the first and the last, and that's the one we seek. He is the one we seek, and He is the matlub and the maqsood, the one we seek after, and the one for whose sake we abstain from all of these things. So we want to talk about how we're going to face Ramadan spiritually in the circumstances we're facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, we're all dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Many of us are dealing with a lot of chronic stress. A lot of us are dealing with a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of uncertainty about when this is going to end. A lot of people are at their breaking point because they can't go out and leave their home. Many people are really stressed out about the loss of income. They're worried about layoffs, being furloughed. They're worried about their businesses closing. Some of you may have businesses and you may have employees that you're responsible for. And that's adding to your own stress because you have to worry about making payroll, and that affects those individuals and their families as well as yours. And if you're a parent and you have children, of course, you're dealing with that chronic stress of dealing with your own uncertainty about the financial situation, the society, and you're also dealing with the stress and uncertainty of your children being out of school and relying more on you. So there's a lot of chronic stress and anxiety that most people are going through. And if you have medical issues, if you have respiratory issues, or you're immunocompromised, you're also worried about the anxiety of the coronavirus itself. You're worried about your family, your parents, your elderly relatives, and yourself. That's the reality that we're all facing, and we have to be real. We have to be open about the stress and anxiety that we're feeling. There's no shame in saying, I'm really stressed out and I'm feeling a lot of anxiety about how I'm going to deal with all of this and also deal with Ramadan. That's our reality for Ramadan 2020. And we don't want to frame this in a way that's going to be self-defeating and adding stress to the stress that many of us are already going through. There's some people, some Muslim popular speakers and different media personalities who are going on social media saying that, oh, this is going to be the absolute best Ramadan ever because we're going to be in seclusion, we're going to be in khalwa, just us worshiping Allah Ta'ala, the serenity of long nights in prayer, quiet prostrations in the night, recitation of the Quran quietly between us and Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. And we're going to lack the communal spirit of Ramadan because we won't be in the masajid, but we're going to have that enhanced connection with Allah Ta'ala in Ramadan. Now, these statements are meant to be motivational. They're meant to encourage people to come into Ramadan in these circumstances with a particular focus. But it simply adds more stress to the stress that people are already feeling. Because the person's hearing that message, that this is going to be the best Ramadan ever spiritually, and in their minds, they're saying to themselves, okay, I'm dealing with all of this stress, all of this anxiety and uncertainty. And on top of that, I'm being told that if this is not the absolute best Ramadan ever, I'm a complete failure, right? Usually when a person is feeling all-encompassing anxiety and stress, it's hard for them to feel like they're being very productive, right? We need a lot of emotional resilience, but we have to recognize the reality that we're going through. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Asr that everyone is at loss except those who have iman and those who do righteous actions. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And they encourage each other with haqq, with truth, and they encourage each other with patience. We have to recognize and be honest with ourselves that this might be, for many of us, a very stressful Ramadan. And it might not feel like the best Ramadan for all of us because of all of the things going on around us. Nevertheless, we fast for the sake of Allah. And we fast out of iman. And we fast with that ihtisab, that anticipation of reward, regardless of the circumstances. So while we may not feel that it's the best Ramadan we've ever had, it might be the best Ramadan that we've ever had on our mizan, on our scale of good deeds on the Day of Judgment. So, we're not worshiping the feelings that we come into Ramadan with. We acknowledge the stress and anxiety, and we try our best, and we remind each other with truth and remind each other to be patient. This is all about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't want to give the message to ourselves, our families, or our communities that in these very difficult circumstances, you're fasting by yourself at home. You need to do this, 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 this. It has to be your best Ramadan ever. You have to be in khalwa. You have to pray inside your closet in the darkness of night. And because you're not going to the masjid, that's what you should be doing. And if this is not your best Ramadan, you're a failure. This is not the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Bashiru wa la tunaffiru, yassiru wa la tu'assiru." Give glad tidings and do not push people away. Make things easy and do not make things difficult. So this is not the time to be telling ourselves this is going to be the most uber, super spiritual Ramadan ever, right? When a person is facing all of these stresses and anxiety, the best thing they can come into the month with is a recognition of that stress and anxiety and relinquishing their sense of control or relinquishing that need to micromanage every facet of Ramadan. It's a Ramadan of sabr. It is a Ramadan of under test. It is going to demand a lot of us. And I think it's important that we are mature in recognizing that and understanding that it's okay to feel that we're facing extra anxieties and facing Ramadan. So yes, there must be effort. And it's also a recognition of our poverty and need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this crisis. So this is the month of resignation, of taslim and tafweed. Allah ta'ala says in the Quran, وَأُفَوِّضُ أَمْرِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. And I resign my affair to Allah ta'ala. So we want to have that determination now that the Ramadan is about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's not about fulfilling a million expectations for this to be the most super spiritual Ramadan that we've ever had in our life. If we have that kind of himmah and we have that intention, fine. But we don't want to put that out there to people, making them feel guilty about enduring the stress and fasting under these circumstances. So what are some particular advices to give for fasting the month of Ramadan in these unprecedented circumstances? What are the things that we can, little things that we can do to uh, make it a bit easier and also get the spiritual benefit in addition to the day-to-day fasting? I would recommend for everyone to consider having virtual iftars. Um, if you have Zoom or Skype and you have connection with family and friends, consider that. Um, some people are old-fashioned and it just seems really weird to do that, but it's, something is better than nothing. If you have a communal iftar on Zoom or on Skype, you have your widescreen monitor or you have your tablet or something set up in your dining room with some family and friends. It's on with all of them while you're there together eating and having some conversation. It's something to attempt if you want to have that social benefit in the absence of physical congregation in the masjid. Also, before the iftar each night, starting on Friday, we're going to have about a half an hour to 40 minutes before Ramadan. The announcement will go out about the details. We're going to have a class where we're covering a very important text. Usually we do a class about 25 minutes before Salat al-Isha, after the iftar in the masjid. And given these circumstances, we're going to do it before iftar so that people can sit and listen and benefit and learn during that time before they break the fast. We're going to be covering a text called Matharatul Qulub, which means the purification of the hearts. It's a book on 29 different illnesses of the hearts, their etiology, where they come from, and their cure. And it's sort of a coincidence that there's 29 of these that the author, Sheikh Muhammad Mawlud, covers, and there's about 29 days of Ramadan or 30 days. And that's going to be a group activity. There'll be a book coming out with it for you to read along and study. There'll be some exercises to learn about the diseases of the heart and how to cure them. And also in this Ramadan, I was talking about the dua list or the making extra dua. I want to emphasize this. A lot of times when we're making dua, we intend to make dua for people or situations, but as we're making dua, we fall back on the familiar and we repeat some of the same things we say in other duas. We are reminded that the month of Ramadan, or when we're fasting, the fasting person's dua is mustajab. It's answered, is guaranteed accepted. So one of the advices we hear from our teachers is to make a list of things you want to make dua for. That's meaning you literally sit down before Ramadan and brainstorm, write down as many things as you want that you want to pray for yourself, for your family, for others. Anything that you can imagine that you want to ask Allah for, you put it in a list, you can number it, and you could use that to remind yourself of what you want to pray for during the month. You can even have it out and look at it as you're making dua so that you can cover all of these things you want to ask Allah Ta'ala for. This will open up the doors and opportunity for increased munajat, increased intimate discourse, making dua to Allah Ta'ala, and it allows you to ask about those people and situations that you would like to pray for, but you may often forget. Okay? And I want to offer some closing remarks about Taraweeh prayers. This is about the spiritual dimensions of fasting, but we're going to touch on something regarding the rulings of Taraweeh because it's a common question people are asking. The Taraweeh prayer is an emphasized sunnah due to the continued practice of the four rightly guided khulafa. It is a recommended emphasized sunnah for both men and women, and it's considered a sunnah kifayiyya, a communal sunnah. And the Prophet ﷺ has told us, "Man qama Ramadan imanan wa ihtisaba ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbi." We mentioned earlier the hadith that whoever fasts Ramadan out of iman and anticipation of reward, that person's prior sins will be forgiven. The Prophet ﷺ also said, whoever stands in prayer during Ramadan out of iman and anticipation of reward, their past sins will be forgiven. So, according to this, it's disliked for a person to abandon the Taraweeh prayers altogether. And in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa in particular, it's actually considered sinful to abandon the Taraweeh altogether with persistence. As far as performing the Taraweeh in the masjid, in Jama'ah, that is a communal sunnah, a sunnah kifaiya, which means that people are allowed to pray the Taraweeh at home if people are praying it in the masajid. Now, we have extenuating circumstances where, at least for the time being, until we know more, the Taraweeh prayer will not be established in the masajid. So we have to look at praying them at home. Now, in last night's class, we were talking about the fiqh of fasting according to the school of law of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayh. And along the same lines, in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, the confirmed sunnah raka'at for Taraweeh is 20 rak'ahs. This is also the position of Imam al-Shafi'i. But given the unique challenges that we're facing this Ramadan with praying Taraweeh at home, there's two issues I want to address here. Issue number one, a lot of people would find it difficult to pray 20 rak'ahs on their own at home. You know, for them, the prospect of praying those 20 rak'ahs at home and not behind an imam in the masjid is very difficult. Number two, a lot of people are wondering how they're going to offer Taraweeh at home when they're not a hafiz of the Quran. So I want to address these two issues, but in addressing them, I want to address two different audiences in our community. Two different audiences. I want to address the audience of those who want to hold to the tradition of 20 rak'ahs, and I also want to address those in the community who are open to consider a valid alternative found within the other schools of Islamic law. And a person is free to choose either of these. There's la haraj, there's no problem in either. So the first audience are those who want to hold to the tradition of 20 rak'ahs, and they want to consider how they're going to do that in Ramadan in 2020, given the shutdown. If you're going to stick to the tradition of 20 rak'ahs in Taraweeh in this Ramadan, I invite you to consider a mental shift and consider it not as 20 long rak'ahs, but consider it 5 sets of 4 rak'ahs. So 2 and 2, set 1. 2 and 2, set 2. You only have 5 sets of 4, that's 20. And when you offer the 20 rak'ahs at home, you can recite the short surahs that you know. Even if it's only a handful, you can repeat them. That's absolutely fine. Likewise, you don't have to pray the 20 rak'ahs consecutively, back to back, one after the other, going from rak'ah number 1 to rak'ah number 20 without stopping. The actual name of this prayer is Salatul Taraweeh, which means it's the prayer of rest, because there's rest periods in between them. Those rest periods, we know in the masajid, after every 4, there's a brief rest period. That rest period can be extended for as long as you want. If you're praying at home and not behind an imam, if you want to pray 6 rak'ahs after Isha, and then some later on in the night, and then some at tahajjud time in the last third, completing 20, that's absolutely fine. The key is not to consider it a burden. You don't want to come to the prayer feeling that it's a burden on you. Consider the prayer as an expression of shukr, an expression of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and anticipate those rewards from Allah ta'ala and that forgiveness for standing in the night. That's the first audience. So the audience who wants to pray the 20, but they're wondering how, consider that advice. Now, audience number two, we said, are those who are open to an alternative and valid position from the other schools of law in Ahl Sunnah. So in light of the circumstances that we're facing with the coronavirus and the shutdown, I would invite those of you who are open to this to adopt the position in the school of Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayh. And that's because in the school of Imam Malik, in their formulation of this position, the 20 rak'ahs of Taraweeh is not a fixed number that one has to pray. There's a number of different rak'ahs that have been suggested, and one is open to pray whatever is easy in their home if they wish to. Imam Ibn Abi Zayd mentioned in his Risala, which is a classical text in Maliki law, he says, if you stand to pray Qiyam in Ramadan with the amount that is easy for you, that is sufficient for you to hope in reward for it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, you're not bound to any specific number of rak'ahs when praying Taraweeh. It's whatever you're capable of doing. So, according to the commentators on the Risala, such as Imam Ahmad Zarruq and Imam Al-Adawi, they say that even if a person wanted to pray only 2 rak'ahs in Taraweeh, that would be okay, though of course, the more the better. The fixed number of rak'ahs, whether it's 20 or more, that is specific to the imam who is leading Taraweeh in congregation. So in the Maliki school, 20 is mentioned as a number of rak'ahs to pray for Taraweeh, but we also have in the Maliki school the mention of 36 rak'ahs and even 8 rak'ahs. And these are positions within the school. The idea is that there's flexibility in the number of rak'ahs one chooses to pray in Taraweeh, particularly if they're praying them at home. It's recommended to pray Taraweeh at home, even though it's a communal sunnah to pray it in the masjid. So if you pray what you can, if you want to pray 8, that's fine. If you want to pray 10, that's fine. If you want to pray 20, that's fine. And if you want to pray 36, according to Imam Malik, marhaban bikum, you can pray 36. There's no set number, especially if we're looking at the person who's praying it in their home and they're not the imam leading it in the masjid. So that's the issue with regards to alternative viewpoints that we can take in the number of rak'ahs we choose to pray if we're praying it at home. Now, we want to go back to this question about dealing with Taraweeh, and that is, what do you do if you want to pray Taraweeh at home and you're not a hafiz of Quran? We mentioned earlier that you have the position, you're completely allowed to just recite the surahs you already know, even if you're repeating them. You can pray first rak'ah after the Fatiha, reciting Surah Ikhlas, and rak'ah 2, you can recite Surah Nas. And you can repeat that for rak'ahs 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and so on. That's absolutely fine. And you can recite the other surahs that you've memorized. In the Hanafi school, the position in the school is that it's not allowed to read from the Mus'haf, the Quranic text, while in prayer. However, in the Hanafi school, there are 2 opinions. One opinion is that this is not allowed to, and that you can only recite from what you've memorized. There is the position of Imam Hassan al-Shaybani, Imam Muhammad, Imam Abu Yusuf, that you're allowed to hold the Mus'haf in the voluntary prayers, though it's disliked. So again, here, if you want to recite the Quran in its entirety and you want to hold the Mus'haf, the position of Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is that it is allowed for you to hold the Mus'haf text and recite from it while you're leading Taraweeh. Even if you're praying behind someone else, you can do that as well. And if you're going to do that, it's absolutely fine. You can recite 1 page per rak'ah, half a page per rak'ah, a quarter, whatever you want to do. The idea is that you are consistent in doing what is sustainable through Ramadan without overloading yourself in the beginning piling up so many things to do only for it to collapse on you 2 or 3 days in the month of fasting. So these are some basic points of advice and counsel, both spiritually and practically, for fasting the month of Ramadan in our homes during this shutdown due to the coronavirus, and some spiritual counsel. And this is always with the spirit of nasiha, the spirit of giving advice first to myself and then to all of you. Imam Abdullah bin Ali al-Haddad says that when the teacher is teaching with the intention of reminding himself, he escapes the condemnation of Allah Ta'ala, who says, grievous in the sight of Allah is that you say what you do not do. So I ask Allah Ta'ala for myself and for all of you, tawfiq, for this enabling grace and success in having a very fruitful and beneficial Ramadan, despite the anxieties that we're facing. We ask Allah Ta'ala to remove those anxieties and to give us a relief from the distress of the uncertainty and difficulties that we're facing. We ask Allah Ta'ala to accept from us our fasting and our standing. We ask Allah Ta'ala to give us very large and beneficial intentions coming into the month. Ameen. Now, so inshallah, we'll open it up for any questions in the comment section in the chat feature. Sister Kokab says, Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam. Just want to confirm that one is allowed to read from the text in Taraweeh prayer. So I'm presenting the position that, one would take the Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali position to hold the Mus'haf and recite in prayer if they wish to do so. If someone is a real stickler for being consistent in having their prayer and their fasting according to one school of law, which is absolutely fine, then they can take recourse in the position of Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf in the Hanafi school, which does allow to hold the Mus'haf. That position does exist in the Hanafi school, though it's not the standard. Sheikh Faiz, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ishfaq, assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam. What is the ruling on making up missed days of fasting from Ramadan that are more than a year in the past, such as missed days from 4 to 5 years ago, but were not made up? So there's, one of the challenges we have in North America is because we come from many different regions of the world, there are different approaches to Islamic law and fatwa, and we have to be careful there. So my intention last night in the workshop was to present the basic fiqh of fasting according to the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. And that's not because I am particularly Hanafi. I'm not. The school of law that I've trained under is that of Imam Malik, Maliki school. Nevertheless, because the majority of our community comes from the subcontinent, that is the school of law that is most familiar. If not directly, then indirectly from their teachers and the society as a whole. So if I'm sticking to that position, in the Hanafi school, you simply have to make up those days. In the other schools, if the time elapses and you go into the next Ramadan without having made those up, you have to make them up after that Ramadan, and you have to pay the penalty. But we're going to relate the position of the Hanafi school that you simply have that as a debt to Allah Ta'ala that remains for you, that you have to make up after the current Ramadan. Allahu A'lam. So make them up, inshallah. This challenge is there mostly for sisters, mostly for the ladies, because of multiple pregnancies, with postnatal bleeding in Ramadan occurring, and also the menstruation. This is a very common occurrence with a lot of ladies where they have an accumulated number of days because of pregnancies, where they have to make those days up, and they're getting to the next Ramadan and they haven't made them up, and it accumulates. Then you have the menstruation in the next Ramadan, and then you have the days before that. So a good idea is to make a chart, to chart out, keep track of the days that you missed, and simply put an X or a check on those dates that you make up, and write the date down so that you know that you fulfilled those days. The best opportunity is to do that in the winter time when fasting is short and relatively easy. And that way you can get more days in consecutively to make up what was missing in the past. Allahu A'lam. Okay, so there's two other questions. Sheikh Faiz, how can I share yesterday and today's class with my family? Inshallah, Brother Muhsin will advise. Okay. Dr. Salah, assalamu alaikum. He says, must a person stick to only one madhab, or can a person follow different madhahib in certain issues? Well, we were going to have a workshop on this. I don't, sometime in the summer. I don't recall the exact date, but that was the intention of ours. We wanted to have a workshop over a couple of days to look at the inner workings of Islamic law. How does the structure of Islamic law work? How do the schools of law operate? And we want to address the issue of having Islamic literacy in knowing the ins and outs of how the schools of Islamic law work. And we've addressed the issue of ijtihad and taqlid and following schools of law, and whether one has to stick to only one, or can they follow the positions of other schools. It's a very complex discussion, but I will suffice by mentioning a couple of points. Point number one, the majority of the scholars of usul, of Islamic legal theory, say that the school of law of the common person who's not a mujtahid, who's not a trained Islamic scholar, is the madhab of the person who's giving them the fatwa, the mufti. Because to have a madhab in that sense is to be trained in the legal methodology and the sources of that school. That's one way of looking at it. So if you're in Egypt and all of the ulama around you are from Al-Azhar, and let's say the majority of them are trained in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, well, those are going to be the muftis you go to for getting your questions answered. And because they've trained under the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, they are Hanafi in their legal training, so the rulings they give you will be according to that. Does that make you a Hanafi? Well, yes and no. Yes, insofar as you're following that school to give your ibadat a consistent structure. But you're not a Hanafi in the sense that you have formal training in the school and its legal methodology. So it's kind of a yes or no there. And if you're in Morocco, then chances are the mufti you're going to go to for your questions will be trained in the school of Imam Malik, because that's the dominant madhab in Morocco. And if you're in Pakistan or India, it's going to be the Hanafi school. And this is how it works. So the lay person, the non-mujtahid, isn't legally required to follow one school in every single issue. But we have to be careful that we're not going from one school to another for rulings and mixing them together in a way that will lead to absurdities or rituals that are inconsistent and seen as invalid by all of them. Again, it's a little complex. They call this talfiq, this kind of borrowing, mixing and matching of schools. So if the talfiq is in a single issue, that can be problematic. So for example, we look at ritual purification, tahara, and salat. The two are intertwined. If you don't have proper tahara, proper wudu, then your salah is invalid. So if a person makes wudu in a way that is considered valid according to one school, but invalid according to another school, that's fine. but they have to make sure that their prayer that they offer with that purification is also seen as valid according to the school. So, for instance, if you are in the Hanafi school, for instance, if or sorry, in the Shafi'i school, if you wipe your hair and you do this, that's fine. However, when you come into the prayer, you have to recite Surah Al-Fatiha in every rak'ah, even if you're behind the imam. Now, in the Hanafi school, that wouldn't be enough. If a person was to just wipe the front of their hair like this, their wudu would be sound. But if they prayed salat as a Hanafi without reading Al-Fatiha, their salah would be invalid according to the Shafi'is, and it would be invalid according to the Hanafis, but for different reasons. It will be invalid according to the Hanafis because that person didn't have a proper wudu, and it will be invalid according to the Shafi'is because that person did not recite Surah Al-Fatiha. That's a kind of talfiq where the act of worship can be invalid because they're mixing and matching. But that's not what we're talking about here. If a person ensures that they learn their fiqh of tahara, of ritual purification, and the fiqh of salat in a consistent manner, according to one school, it is absolutely fine for that person to follow the rulings of another school in other issues outside of prayer, such as fasting or zakat or hajj. So for instance, let's say you've learned the fiqh of purification and prayer according to the Hanafi school. Alhamdulillah, you now have consistent structure for your ritual worship. This is good. Does that mean that you have to follow the Hanafi school in every single detail in matters of fasting too? Not necessarily. For the lay person, that's not their duty. They don't have to do that. They can fast according to the school of Imam Malik if they want to, as long as that single action is internally consistent and sound. And if they want to make Hajj according to the positions of the school of Imam Abu Hanifa and their Shafi'i, that's fine. And guess what? Shafi'i is going to be doing that anyway, because in the Shafi'i school, you can't really maintain tahara and make tawaf and Hajj at the same time. So if it's in separate acts of worship like that, is completely fine. If it's in a single act of worship, it can be problematic, but it's not a simple issue, really. There's some complexity there. Wallahu a'lam. Let's go back. Questions came in. Sister Kokab, even with my sincere intention to make up my misfast, what if I die before that? Well, you had asked a question last night about making fasting on behalf of other people, and you clarified that this is concerning people who have passed on, who have died, and we made a distinction between the person who intentionally breaks their fast in Ramadan, who owes a kafara to pay of fasting 60 days consecutively, and the person who missed fast and they intended to make them up, but they were unable due to whatever condition, and they passed away. If a person makes Hajj on behalf of someone who's deceased, or fasts those kind of days on their behalf, that's absolutely fine. That's separate from the accountability issue of a person who purposely neglects fasting. So in your case, inshallah, Allah gives you a long and healthy life, and you make up your fast. Say Ameen, Ameen. But in the event that does happen to someone, their family members can fast on their behalf, because those fasts, they intended to make them up. They were going to, but they passed away. Inshallah, I hope that answers the question. Okay. I think that's it. Yep. Inshallah. So if there's no other questions, so just an announcement. I mentioned about the text that we're going to cover in Ramadan. The past couple of years, we were, before Isha by around 20, 25 minutes, we were having a class in the masjid. And in both years, we were looking at tafsir of Quran. We're looking at some of the themes within each juz of the Quran being recited that night. And this year, we're going to do something different. We're going to look at a very small text called Mataratul Qulub. It's actually a poem, and it's been translated into English. And inshallah, we're going to look at it because it talks about the 29 diseases of the heart. It looks at their etiology, how they arise and develop, their causes, and how to cure them. This is a very, very powerful text. It's 29 diseases, so we'll cover, we're not going to cover one disease each night because some of them we'll mention too. And we'll look at some of the detailed cures and the general cures towards the end of Ramadan as we go through the text. But it's fortuitous that it's 29 and we have 29 days or 30 days of Ramadan. And inshallah, I'll be sending out the PDF with the Arabic of the poem as well as the English translation, and inshallah some exercises and some points of reflection that relate to each of those diseases, so that each day, inshallah, before the iftar, you and your families, inshallah, can sit and we'll go over the text, and you'll have the text to read as well before the class and after, to refer back to as you go through each of those diseases and learn about them and apply the cures in the month of Ramadan, inshallah ta'ala. So with that, we close and we ask Allah ta'ala for tawfiq, for success, and to give us an increase in yearning for receiving the honored guests of Ramadan, and to give all of us and our families in the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam ease and facilitation in these challenging circumstances with the shutdown and with coronavirus, and to give shifa and afiyah to all of us and our loved ones. Ameen. Bijahi Sayyid al-Mursaleen sallallahu alaihi wasallam. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.